Thank you everyone for coming to today's Complex Human Data seminar series. We're pretty lucky to have Tilman Dingler talking. He's a lecturer at the School of Computing and Information Systems here at UniMelp, and he's, again, kind of perfect for this lecture series because his work is a combination of computer science and technology and also cognitive science. So he's really interested in how people use technologies to augment their cognitive abilities, memory, information processing, and that sort of thing. He's worked all over the world, including Japan and also the MIT Media Lab before coming here. And he's worked at several different startups. And so, yeah, so today he'll be talking about a particular aspect of his work of how people receive and process information, focusing on misinformation and bots. So I'll turn it over to Tilman here. And as always, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. If it's sort of super important, is it okay, Tilman, if people ask in the middle of your talk, or would you prefer they save till the end?
Absolutely, questions anytime.
All right, great, cool. All right, go ahead.
Cool, thank you, Andy. Thanks for the invitation. And Andy and I, we had actually a couple of conversations across the past 2 years. One's here, one's there. And I think a lot of the work is actually inspired by those. So I'm really curious, because most of this is very preliminary in terms of its result. I'm really curious to hear what you think and where we could take this. And I'm very interested in your ideas and also in your possible collaborations, since I come from a very technology-centered perspective. And we oftentimes really naively apply a lot of the kind of perceptual and cognitive models that the psychology supplies us with. And we kind of really interested in bringing a lot of these theories into the wild, kind of like, do these hold through still when we build applications, for example, on top of those, and how do people use these technologies over time, and how does it change maybe their attitudes and perspectives? And so this is really, I hope to get out of this a discussion, a conversation with all of you about, is this a promising path forward, like applying technologies to this massive problem with this information. So let me share my slides real quick. Can I share screen? Yes, good. Do you see one? Shout out if you don't see that. Okay. So I tailored this really toward also what Andy gave the perfect setup actually on Friday at the information or disinformation and misinformation seminar series. About the massive problems that we're facing nowadays, and I'm just going to get a little bit into it, like how that came about. But basically, I'm going to focus hopefully more on the ideas and the countermeasures we can take to battle this and to instill a bit more of critical thinking in users in general, be that technology users or people like reading news. But yeah, okay. So just to give you a brief background about me, as Andy said, I've been hopping a bit all over the place in the past few years. I'm originally, as you can hear, from Germany, did my media computer science degree there, and then went over and applied those in the Silicon Valley for a few years. As I kind of was considered the mecca for technology, and everyone wanted to be part of that at the time, and it was an exciting time. And then my later PhD supervisor basically stated, hey, do you want to go back to academia and kind of like finish what you started? And at the time that seemed a very reasonable choice, given where Silicon Valley was headed. And I was working for Yahoo, and I think I survived 3 different CEO changes. So if I just waited more time in line, maybe I would have been next, but that was very unlikely to happen. And so I decided actually, doing a PhD in computer action was more along the lines of what I was interested in, kind of like, how do people use technologies? How can we find out more about how the changes that the technologies brings with it? And I was particularly very interested in learning aspects. So how do people process information? What does technology know about our information habits? And how can we build sensing technologies to look a little bit into the mind of people? And so I came here about 2.5 years ago as a research fellow, initially in ubiquitous computing, working with Vasilis Kostakos and colleagues. And yeah, since earlier this year, I've also taken up a bit of a teaching role. So my kind of like background really is this notion of cognition-aware systems. So every one of you probably knows about like context awareness. So what do these devices know about the context that we use them in? And they're pretty much simple examples are a landscape portrait mode changing interface depending on how you turn the phone, right? So there's a sensor that senses the context of the device and then adjusts the interface. There's been tons of research on like how to use location for applications or motion sensors and pressure sensors and all kinds of like different sensing technologies to really tailor to and try to understand what is the user trying to do and then tailor the interface or that functionality really to that suspected use case. And so what was missing at the time really was this perspective of, well, what are more like inherent internal states the user might be in, right? And we usually talk about like emotions and intentions and such like this, but I was more interested in like cognitive states, like how receptive is the user? Is the user actually alert or is the user fatigued? How does that change problem interfaces and the problem with information overload and such? And so the idea really was to sense more about these kind of like alertness or cognitive performance measures, and then see how we can create models to adjust also our interfaces towards that. And here's just a couple of projects that I've done in the past, looking at like how we can sense cognitive states, how we can model systematic variations, and then also how can we adapt the technologies to those states. And one early work here I did with a couple of colleagues back in Stuttgart, but also that was the first collaboration actually here in Australia, looked at thermal imaging and looking at can we use temperature differences and the changes across time in people's facial features and use that and correlate it to cognitive load or mental workload. And so what we found here is actually that the more people kind of like concentrate and work and focus, the more the capillaries open up, blood flow increases to the cerebrum, and we can tell that the extremities such as the nose gets colder and the stern gets a bit warmer, and that difference can be nicely tracked in real time as we kind of like monitor the user state. And then we can build, for example, models of engagement and focus and so on for learning systems. But these are in situ assessments. We were also interested in kind of like more systematic variations, so basically circadian rhythms, people's kind of like fluctuations of alertness across the day. And so we adjusted a couple of tasks from your discipline into a mobile toolkit, right? So reaction time tasks, decision-making tasks, spatial multiple spatial object monitoring and stuff like this. In order to collect ground truth on alertness measures for people and then train models based on, for example, sensor data or how people use their phones to automatically figure out how alert people actually are. And one of these works actually with Benjamin here in the audience led to this publication in kind of correlating eye blinks throughout the day to this kind of like alertness levels. So as we can see across the day, our blink frequency basically goes up along with our reaction time. And so by simply wearing a device, in this case, an EOG equipped glass brim, we can basically figure out whether the homeostatic process is present and how strong that is present in people. So basically, the more hours people spend awake, the more tired they become, the more the sleep kind of deprivation sets in. And then more recently, we also looked at whether we can see that interaction data. So how do people use their phones? A lot of people play games. And so we correlated some of these measures to game mechanics and see whether people committed more errors, whether their reaction times also increased. And here we also found a lot of indications of homeostatic influence in different subtasks that were comparable to their task battery. And obviously that's, this is what I meant by kind of like when we take things into the wild, into like applications, we introduce a lot of noise, and you might say, well, have the task been validated, right? And so what we're trying to do is kind of like, can we motivate the underlying metrics in those games with metrics we know from psychology, and then on top of all this, be it that a user interface, be that game mechanics and so on, how much of that noise can still be filtered out in order to see the remains of a signal? And so this is an example where we actually do see some of that, especially for the homeostatic influence. And so we can basically use game data, given that people play it for an extended amount of time, and use that to kind of like figure out what are their kind of circadian variations across the day. Yes, and basically with that's where I came from, and we did a lot of applications in terms of like how to cater learning system and adjust learning system, reduce clutter, reduce distractions, increase the complexity of interfaces to adjust for example, a increased bandwidth that the user have available. But then at some time, or 2 years ago, or actually earlier, probably with the presidential election in 2016, I realized that pushing more information on the user is not really the goal here, right? So it's not always about just making people learn more stuff, but it's more about what's the quality of the learning? What is the kind of, how deep is the processing of the information that we're being fed? And so we really started shifting our focus from pure volume to what are the inherent characteristics of informations and in the processing of such that make people formulate opinions or inform their decision making and so on. And especially, you know, with what Indy said on Friday, and what probably more of you also work on, this phenomenon of which we find ourselves all of a sudden in our information society, where can we trust the sources of information that we find? What kind of influence does that information have, and so on? And so this 2019 survey here on fake news is really alarming, has been really alarming in terms of this was a poll with 25,000 internet users worldwide, and that says basically 86% of people that they surveyed had at least fallen victim or believed in one of the news, fake or fabricated news stories at least once in their life. And 75% also said that they hold social media companies responsible for the general distrust in the information on the web. And kind of like when I reflected on that, I also realized, well, quite recently, actually, I've still fall victim to this. I'm not immune myself. So there was this really neat and cute little story about the COVID restrictions leading to the channels of Venice becoming cleaner all of a sudden, and dolphins and swans were supposed to have returned to, not that they actually ever were there, but were supposed to have returned to Venice, which was completely fabricated. But it was so tied into what we want to believe, or what I wanted to believe at the time, but what might be the upsides of all this negatives of COVID, that I actually said, oh, this is really nice, right? Unfortunately, it was not the case, and it's not true, and it's as dirty and filthy as it ever was in Venice. Another story that I initially kind of like connected to, oh yeah, that could totally be true, was a story about how Trump basically redirected materials that were meant to protect health workers in other places, in this case Germany. So there's inherent national bias here in myself, obviously. And this story basically said, well, they took a shipment from Singapore and redirected it to the US. So kind of like a modern case of piracy, right? And so even though, you know, we like to think of ourselves, or I like to think of myself as a critical thinker, it's really easy to fall into this kind of confirmation bias. Like, yeah, of course, Trump would totally do something like this, and you know, playing into some kind of a national pride and our own kind of like perspective on the world really makes us susceptible to these kind of yeah, news stories, whether we like it or whether we are aware of it or not. And so the second really is this the spread of false information, right? So it took me a while to figure out, obviously, that these stories were false. And if we look at kind of like how these information spread, I didn't share any of it but that's mostly because I rarely share anything on social media. And of course, we know that there's good practices about sharing, such as source checking and stuff. But in general, we know that false information actually has a much more propensity and spreads further and deeper than true information. And that's pretty alarming, especially when we consider that a majority of, or increasing amount of people now get their primary news from online platforms and social media. And so the fallout of all this, right, is that not only like are we misinformed, but we may base our decisions on these kind of like false premises. And so our decision making in itself is compromised in a sense. In a grand scale of things, we do see, you know, people not really not knowing where to turn to, trusting information sources, and so therefore also undermining a lot of the sources that we used to hold dear and we thought we could trust, right? Such as our leaders and such as our democratic institutions. And with that comes kind of like a self-selection of media sources rather than an objective view. So basically, I go to the places where I think that I find the trustful information, and I ignore the ones that I think that they pump out a lot of these misleading informations, right? And that leads to this kind of like notion of polarization, because if everyone kind of gets the information from the sources that they trust and are kind of comfortable with, then all of a sudden we end up living in very parallel societies, in very polarized societies, and it makes it really, really hard to have conversations that bridge the gap if we're not even able to come together to define basic assumptions or facts on which our base our discussions on, and that eventually can lead to quite hostile interchanges, right? As we've seen recently. So just a couple of clarifications in terms of like when I talk about fake news, what I mean by that. I purely base my definitions here on a Science article from David Laser and colleagues. Basically, fake news being something that mimics news content in its form, but not necessarily in the kind of like rigor, the journalistic rigor that we would expect from it. Also in the intent, which is not necessarily to inform, but basically has certain biases in their intention baked into it. And there's basically two types here. The misinformation that is initially presented as true, but later found to be false. So this can be spread unintentionally. So if I had, for example, shared that cute little dolphin story, I would probably not have had the intent to mislead people, but I just wanted to share my joy about those mammals returning to the Mediterranean. But then there's disinformation, right? Which is more a purpose and an intent behind the spreading with an intent, a specific intent to deceive. And we do see that, unfortunately, a lot when we look at kind of like in party framing and policy framings and such. And so social media, who've been criticized quite a lot for this, basically have been faced three options to kind of battle this, right? So in 2016, their general approach was not do anything. Right, just let kind of like the wisdom of the crowd sort it out. Have people just post whatever the hard content feels like, and so hoping that over time that these things, like the truth prevails and things sort themselves out. But unfortunately, due to a lot of mechanisms also that Andy has talked about on Friday, this is rarely the case that things sort themselves out, because some people, they have louder voices, especially when people have really strong opinions. They tend to post, a lot more than people who kind of like, yeah, the majority of people who is not very active in spreading their own opinions, but very active in consuming a lot of stuff that is out there. And so the no interference in 2016 has clearly shown that that's not a model that these companies want to continue. So then they're really left with two other options, either to ban misinformation altogether and the users that share it. And this is kind of like a very nuclear option. We've seen this lately with the supposed find of Hunter Biden's laptop, and the news story around that there was pornographic material and incriminating evidence and all that. And so I think it was Twitter who said, no, we're going to ban all the stories related to that until we know more. And that option created obviously a lot of resentments on groups that are quite interested in incriminating Hunter Biden and with that the presidential candidate. And so they then talk about how freedom of speech is violated, and this is an interference in itself in the election process by banning people from their platforms, right? So this is a very tricky. So basically, by trying not to interfere, these platforms actually interfere, right? Well, that's the alleged case. So that's the nuclear option. And then the third one is, and we've seen this over the years kind of pop up more and more, is to flag and delay certain information. So for example, Facebook started having these little flag symbols in the corner with news items and also symbols that says, oh, this is a legitimate source, it has been verified, and also gives the user to an option to flag certain materials. So we have like legit sources, and here we have, for example, something that looks to Facebook looks like clickbait. And this is interesting because that's actually an article about the research project of one of our colleagues. And so you can already see here that the automatic flagging has its challenges. And then the question becomes, the more we see these flags being falsely applied, how quickly do we actually throw out our own trust in these kind of like flagging mechanisms, especially when they happen in the beginning, when they're quite in their child's shoes, like when they're really premature and novel. And then we can also use the wisdom of the crowds again to help us or help these platforms to kind of like flag stuff. But again, there might be actors who are disproportionately active, more active than others. And so that's also quite a tricky thing to do. Which leaves us with this notion of kind of like fact checking. And if we look at the fact checking platform and how they kind of like developed in the last recent years, they have grown in numbers. So here we have, for example, in 2014, there were 44 of those fact-checking sites, and now 2 years ago, actually 149. Would be interesting to see whether that has doubled or more than doubled by now. But basically, we see this kind of like progression and increase in fact-checking. It is often, unfortunately, a manual process, or has been, as it's very tedious to kind of get behind stories and to pull together the pieces of evidence that might confirm or disconfirm a certain story. And I know of some colleagues also here in the audience who are working on more automated processes in order to make this more scalable. And to, for example, classify news based on how it's being spread, or based on the language that's being used, or based on the layout of articles and the source associations of them. So these are kind of like things that we're seeing that are increasingly becoming more sophisticated, which is, I guess, is the good news here. But then there's this problem with well, even if we flag it, and even if we have, for example, a system that can tell us 100% whether something is fabricated or fake or truthful, how do we correct this kind of like quick spread of information? And you probably heard of these movies about the pandemic. Basically an anti-vaxxer movie, which shortly after its release was already viewed tens of millions of times before it was effectively taken down from the major platforms. So a lot of the damage was already done, and a lot of the damage continues to be done in terms of how do we actually get people to listen to reason, right? And so there's these two effects, one being kind of the continued influence effect. So basically just based on that I used to believe in a certain aspect, I tend to kind of like continue my initial beliefs. And we've seen this in multiple studies by Ecker and colleagues, that it's never, or it's really, really hard to completely eradicate a preconceived notion. And then Lewandowski and his colleagues, they really looked at what happens if people have really, really strong commitments to their preconceived notions. And they've seen that people actually tend to double down on even when they're facing contradicting evidence. So basically, rather than kind of like reconsidering our position, we kind of like take a stubborn stance and defend our position even stronger. So this is huge problems, right? So even if those kind of like automated systems work in a perfect manner, how do we actually get that information to the people? How do we make people listen? How do we make people engage with information? And so we started this project around the notion of, okay, we need fact checks that are, one, immediate, in order to kind of like cut off the spread very early, and that are ubiquitous. And ubiquitous in a sense that you don't need to go to a fact-checking website or wait until a story is disconfirmed on a website, but we can be that on our phone, be that on our in our newsreader, we can immediately kind of like check, is this actually something that I've heard? What do other people think is something true? So basically, this is the notion of reducing the friction or the kind of like the inertia to get fact checks done. That's what I mean by ubiquitous. And the earlier we can do that, the better. So me and my colleagues, we built this browser plugin, which basically allows you to highlight any sentence that you come across on any website and do a fact check on it. So basically right click and it sends it off to our system, and then our system kind of comes back with a couple of pieces of evidence that it thinks are related or relevant to this. And if it's really certain, it can even say whether that is a false information or whether the information actually confirms or the claim confirms the evidence confirms the claim, and so on. And so we built this system as a browser plugin for Chrome. It's called Get Your Facts Straight, and it basically matches the claims with pieces of evidence. And so in the back end, we basically parsed Wikipedia and the Fever data set, as well as PolitiFact and Scopes, I think, to kind of like get a couple hundreds of thousands of statements, and then to see how well that it technically does in terms of matching certain claims to certain pieces of evidence. And then the second challenge being like, once it has that, how do we actually present that evidence to our user? And so in the background, we have kind of like this document retrieval. So basically the claim of the new coronavirus cannot be transmitted through mosquito bites is being highlighted. It gets then sent through the get fact check extension through our API to our server, which then matches it with our kind of claims database and looks for related articles at Wikipedia, kind of supposing that is a crowdsourced trusted source, produces a bunch of evidence through sentence selection and classifies those, and then kind of like feeds them back to the user. Now, I'm not a machine learning type of person. I know there are some people here in the audience that know much more about natural language processing than I do. And so the technical evaluation of this, we did just kind of like as a to see whether generally it works, but obviously there are some flaws with it. So basically, we trained this with 150,000 facts. We tested it with a fourth of that, and then we came up with this magic F score. It's like 74% accuracy, right? Which is probably not very actionable if you think about you want to check a fact, and 1 out of 4 facts come back either completely irrelevant or even pure false, right? So how often do you keep using that tool? Probably not that much, right? So we need obviously much higher accuracy for that. And I hope to collaborate with some of much smarter people in terms of NLP and machine learning than myself to get that part right. But we still wanted to evaluate, like, what is the effect of such an ubiquitous tool, and how can we work on also the user-facing aspect of this. And so we actually then devised various ways that we've seen that in order to present that kind of like information. So we created these 3 conditions. One is basically just showing people a labeled single evidence. It says, okay, this evidence confirms the claim that was highlighted, or it refutes the claim. So that would be our labeled condition. Another story, and this is really about kind of like how do people deal with ambiguity or probabilities, right? So for example, some weather applications are actually much more effective if they give not kind of like it's going to rain, but give a kind of like a notion of a likelihood, probability of rain to come. And so people, even though we are inherently bad at kind of like dealing or conceptualizing probabilities generally, sometimes we might appreciate the fact that the tool itself is not very sure. And so we're really interested in kind of like, what if we not just say, this is good information or this is bad information, but actually, yeah, transmit the confidence of the tool in this piece of evidence matching their claim. And then the third condition is really just the baseline where, oh, I found this evidence, and it's up to the user to make sense of it and to reinterpret whether that refutes or confirms it. And so the research questions we had for this initial study were kind of like, which forms of evidence annotation leads to more fact corrections? Do these instill trust and satisfaction in the user? And what is the feasibility overall of having such a tool at hand where we can highlight and check on the fly? And so we ran, as everyone runs these days, online study using Amazon Turk, where we focused on specifically US, because we didn't want necessarily local politics and also language to be too much of a confound. And so we presented our participants with 12 statements that were balanced in terms of their truthful or their fake content. And so we kind of like presented them statements such as this one here: in 2020, 2 schoolboys in China died suddenly after wearing face masks during physical exercise. And so we had people rate those based on whether they think it's true, whether they think it's fake, whether they have no idea whatsoever. There was an unaware kind of like check marks, and then also a confidence score. How confident were our participants when kind of labeling a certain piece of information as true or fake. And so we did this before with all 12 statements, and then we had them fact check basically each of them, and then we asked a bunch of other questions, and then in the end we had the same kind of like exercise again, where we asked them, so what do you think now of these statements, and what is your confidence in your own kind of judgment about those. And so the fact correction itself looked like this. So people highlighted a claim, and the tool would come back. And again, this is to move away from the inaccuracies of our tool. This was completely canned material. So basically, these were we edited those, or we collected those from fact-checking websites, and so just to control the actual fact correction. And so the tool came back, and then in this case, this is obviously this is condition 1 with kind of like a really clear label that says, oh, this piece of evidence here refutes the claim that you highlighted. And then for each of those, we collected feedback, like, is this something you're satisfied with, and or that you find trustworthy in terms of the correction? And then we took a couple of measures. So first of all, we have these kind of like inclinations, right? These pre and post inclinations, whether people think it's something is true or fake, or they're completely unaware. They have the confidence ratings. And then for each of those presentations, we have satisfaction and trust scores. And then we ask also a couple of questions, the post questionnaire, about how useful they found the tool, what were issues with it, would they use it if they had like a reliable tool at hand, and so on. And so here are some of the results, and I just want to highlight a couple. So we looked at, for example, corrected misconceptions. So misconceptions being false statements that were prior believed to be true, false truths, or true statements that were believed to be false. We did not change people's, or we did not change, or correct, falsely correct information, I should say. So all the information we presented was half of it was fake, half of it was true, and the tool would either confirm the true ones or refute the fake ones. And so here we look at how many times people were kind of like wrong in their judgment in the beginning, and how many of that in the very end they were correct to classify correctly. So here we see that labeled evidence led to 61% of misconception being corrected, while the confidence score only corrected 43%. However, the difference wasn't significant. And this is just a pilot right now. Right? So we have 44 data sets that we effectively analyzed. So we'd love to kind of like do another iteration on this and crank up the numbers a bit. But there are some interesting things in here. So in terms of truth and fake corrections, we kind of separated those two with the question in mind whether the tool is more effective to correct fakes or convince users of supporting evidence. Here we can see that labeled evidence led to 63% of truth and 58% of fake corrections. That was significant, but not the post-hoc tests. And we also looked at how many actually were miscorrected. And here also the labeled would give us a much better, like lower score. So only 29% of miscorrections happened, like of all the miscorrections that happened in the data set were accounted to labeled evidence, and 37 to the baseline where people were left to make their own decision. And confidence score, interestingly, actually increased. That was the highest. However, that's not really significant. It's just a trend. Then we have resilient misconceptions. These are basically misconceptions that withstand corrections. And here we see that that labeled actually yielded the least amount of those non-corrected misconceptions. And then we had this kind of like also this notion of learning. So if people were prior unaware of a fact, how much correction can we make with or how convincing is the tool just to teach you some new information? And this is actually really promising, even though between the conditions there's no effect, but the tool itself seems to be very effective in kind of like just, helping people sort out which ones are true and which ones are fake. And then we look at the changes in confidence rating, and then we see in general increase across all conditions, and only in very few cases the confidence actually decreased. In terms of trust, we didn't see a significant difference, but in terms of satisfaction, like self-assessed satisfaction, we do see the omnibus test does see a general effect. However, the pairwise comparison didn't, but we see a kind of like there's this trend of labeled evidence again to be a bit more satisfactory compared to, for example, confidence scores. And so this was really that study where we looked at these two different ways of conveying that information, and found actually that the tool itself was quite effective, especially when it comes to information that didn't have a preconceived notion to it. So if people had this tool at hand and came across something new, they were pretty likely to figure out, given they trust the tool, but they were pretty likely to figure out the correct interpretation of the results. Are there any questions until here? Because otherwise I'll change tack, but I think this is the more interesting part of my talk. So in consciousness of time, I'd like to give you some the opportunity to ask questions maybe at this point.
So I have one actually. Well, I thought it was interesting that there was no difference in trust, but of course this was an immediate thing. And you might expect, like, if the tool is only somewhat accurate, that might lead to differences in trust if it's sort of somewhat accurate, but acts very confident versus not. Sort of, do you plan any kind of follow-ups, or do you know how you might explore that, or what would you expect to find there?
Yeah, I think we need to find a better measure for trust. So first of all, they had to measure their own trust with each statement and each condition, which probably set a couple set in a certain fatigue. So we don't see much variation there in the first place. I'd be really interested in how to systematically assess trust, because I believe that's the main point why we didn't see any statistical significance.
Right. Cool. Any other questions? Now, yeah, we can take a few and then go on, I guess.
I have a quick question. Did you think about adding a condition where you include both the label and the confidence? So basically present confidence with respect to the label rather than with respect to the evidence?
Yeah, so we ran a handful of pilots before this one, and the conditions were quite mixed in the beginning. We also had things like multiple evidences. We had confirming and refuting evidence, and had it kind of like had people sorted out, but it became quite messy in that sense. So this is our version of really isolating as much as we can before moving forward with certain design decisions. But absolutely, the combination will be really interesting to look at, and that's definitely on our agenda.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah.
All right, maybe
I can also keep going and
yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe, yeah, go on and sort of, leave off with at least 5 minutes or so people can ask for some last ones. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, this is ongoing work. This was the preliminary evaluation. We're really interested in further developing this tool, as we thought that some of these results are really interesting, scaling it in terms of people, but also obviously the in the wild aspect needs to be evaluated. So is this actually feasible when people surf the web on their own account? And for that, we need to do some significant work on the back end to not alienate our users by providing faulty or useless evidence. The second part of my talk really tackles this or addresses this idea of polarization. And so the polarization being this idea of where we used to have political parties and politicians come together on certain topics, but kind of like being quite far away on other topics, has become quite divisive in recent years. And here you can see I think that was Pew who published this, and the polarization increase over the over 20 years, and it's gotten even worse now. So basically, this notion of like people pile up at the edges with very strong convictions to a topic, and very little left in the middle to actually base a conversation or an argument on. And so the question really becomes, how do we build bridges? How can I have a conversation with an anti-vaxxer without triggering their ideological fight or flight response? And so this polarization, meaning kind of like this, you have this intense commitment to a candidate, to a culture or an ideology that sets people in one group apart from people in another one. And how do we overcome that? Well, Henry Ford, he had this kind of like view at things that it is your ability to get the other person's point of perspective, as well as your own, that is kind of like a part of success. So we've known this, and yet I guess every generation and every political generation needs to come to terms with that again. And I think right now we're in a very low point, even historically, which we need to kind of like overcome. And so the idea that we came up with in terms of like having people debate with each other, and this is also very much personally motivated because I had a lot of friends living in Barcelona who were very strongly opinionated about the independence movement of Catalonia. And those differences really went through families, and they're their solution to the problem was usually not to talk about it in the first place, at least not over the family dinner. And so the idea is, okay, but who do you talk to, right? So you want to have these conversations, but if you can't have them with friends and family, who do you have them with? And so we've seen a lot of kind of like chats and anonymous the anonymous nature of the internet coming in quite handy here. But also this notion of, hey, I can actually unload all my problems and desires onto a bot and see what the bot thinks, right? So we've seen a lot of dating bots and psychiatrist bots, bot attempts, I should say. And also they're quite critical acclaim here. But people, or especially the younger generation, seem to flock to this kind of communication alternative. And so we were interested in, okay, what if we have actually bots that discuss quite controversial topics, right? Where there might not be a complete black and white, but actually quite some nuance to a discussion. And so we started this work with Radboud University, who were interested in how do conspiracy theory followers react to news delivered through chatbots. And so they ran a study with one of these bots that we built with a highly selected audience in the US of high conspiracy thinkers and low conspiracy thinkers, and to see whether they actually find some of these articles presented by the bot more trustworthy than, for example, if they had been going to a news website. It's really interesting because what we found here is that the determinants of attitudes towards chat groups and intention to use is very different for both of these groups. And trust and perceived usefulness was basically one of the most determinant factors in that study. And if we look at the two groups of high conspiracy thinkers, they tended to trust the chatbot more and held a more positive attitude towards the bot, which is really interesting than low conspiracy thinkers. And why that is interesting, because we naturally would think that that high conspiracies are quite critical when it comes to things or anything that might contradict their views, right? And so bots seems to be a way to actually, seems to be more promising in getting through if maybe one of the reasons being not being judged or not being ridiculed for an argument or a notion they might hold. So this is really I found this very interesting as a preliminary results, and so we kind of like went deeper into this idea of using these bots. And so right now, what we have is 2 or 3 bots on different topics, affirmative speech, and for example, and gun laws and abortion rights. And so you can talk to these bots and kind of like share your opinion, but the bot will also kind of like try to rebut some of the more commonly arguments, counter arguments. And so the bot came originally in 3 flavors. Now we only have 2 because the logical argument didn't seem to sit well with people. So the logical argument being this notion of I ask you a question, what do you think about owning a gun and the importance of such? And then taking the opposite, kind of like just presenting a counter argument or an example, a counter argument, and having that conversation kind of start out with based on logic and rebutting people's argument. The empathetic bot, on the other hand, is a bot that presents a scenario that basically comes with a narrative about, for example, an immigrant coming to Australia and facing certain challenges, or a minority group in affirmative action, for example, having certain challenges, and wouldn't you want to have certain like equality of rights and such? So basically, trying to then frame the narrative in a way where the user could identify themselves with some of these characters in the story. And then the third one was a diplomatic one, which basically, and this is really much based on some of the conversations, Andy, we had 2 years ago, I believe, where you told me that trust is such a big deal, right? So how do you get someone to trust you? Well, you agree with their point of view once, twice, and then once you have that trust, maybe then you can start pushing the needle a little bit towards the middle. And so this is what the diplomatic bot basically tries to do. It tries to figure out where does the user stand on an issue, and then give them a couple of affirmative examples and the arguments, and then slowly starts challenging those notions. And so here we have a really preliminary kind of like study also again with MTurks, where we evaluated the attitude towards different towards these bots, and with regard to these 3 conversation types. And what we see here is that the logical wasn't very much liked. The most promising one was more the diplomatic, interestingly, right? So there's this notion of affirm, disconfirm. Also the empathy was well received, but with more variety or spread in it, I would say. And this is an ongoing study. You can actually, you're welcome to go through this website and try one of those out on your own. We're still shaping the dialogue, and we're really open, especially to feedback from experts who know about conversational design. Also, if you think you have a conversation or something you would like to try out, we have this bot network up and running. It will be really easy and quick to plug something in that you would like to test. We usually take this approach of using pre-post questionnaires. So we integrate the bots into those questionnaires, and have people quickly evaluate whatever conversation you'd like them to have. And with that, I'd like to kind of like close this also. We have a couple more projects, but as you can see, a lot of it is very preliminary. We're basically, we have this vision of instilling some of these nudges towards more critical thinking in the very way that we construct technologies, especially when it comes to information systems. And this is basically here the vision of the critical media technologies that we'd like to push forward a little bit. And with that, open question floor is open. Please do reach out. Here's my email address, or try out some of these prototypes. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you, Tilman. Let's applause. And we've got a little bit of time for a couple questions. I will hold mine, and I'll email you with them later, Tilman. To
Excellent.
Give a chance.
Thank you.
So go ahead and jump in if you've got any questions.
Could I jump in with a question then? I'm fascinated, Tilman, about I'm about to show you that I'm not a critical thinker. So there we go. Fascinating talk, by the way, and I'll just turn my video on.
Thank you.
You mentioned that there was this common misconception that the US diverted some supplies away from people. And when you said that to me, I was shocked, because I thought, yes, I thought that was true. And look, I as a part of my vanity, I just had to go and Google this. And I'm putting up ream after ream of evidence supporting this misconception. Are you actually, I guess I'm really shocked if this is not true, just based on what I've Googled here, and this is going to create another problem. Are you saying that there was actually the US didn't actually divert any supplies at all, just in this one particular instance from Singapore they didn't, but in fact they seem to have diverted it from pretty much everyone else on the planet?
Absolutely. So the example I refer to is the 3M, yes. With especially I think they were meant to go to the German police or something.
Yes.
That was one of the first stories, and I think that was debunked. I have heard those stories from various sources, but I guess I paid less attention to them after the first one. I'm pretty sure about that 3M one, or at least 3M was never able to, or was able to produce evidence to the contrary. But as in terms of like the general effort that they have undertaken, in terms, I'll leave that up to for people to figure out.
Well, you see, this raises another interesting question. So look, I've got 4 stories, some of them from reputable sources like BBC, NPR, which is one of my favorites, The Guardian, which I know happens to do particularly good fact checking, and they're all different. So I reckon I've spent 3 minutes looking at this, but let's assume that the US has at least one of these pans out, the US has diverted it. Doesn't that now make it a case of when people misbelieve this story, it's actually a case of they're just misremembering a true story. So how did you avoid that sort of issue? How did you avoid the issue that, because lots of these misinformation stories are variations on actual true events?
Yeah, and that's the big problem here, right? And this is kind of like this lingering effect also that we talked about, that even something where you're 100% sure that was false, it kind of like lingers in people's collective consciousness or subconsciousness, and that's why I think we need to stop those as early as possible. Because once I've heard this story, like from 5-6 different sources, or from in different occasions, the likelihood of it being completely debunked from a perception point of view is gets lower. I don't have a solution for that, actually. I just think we need to tackle it as early and as ubiquitous as possible.
There's a couple questions in the chat, so maybe do you want to have a go at those, and then we'll
absolutely.
Being mindful of time.
Oh, hi, David.
Probably have to stop there.
Okay, so David is asking, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tilman. My question is largely about, do you think that the conspiracy theorists have got more trust in the bot because they've got a perception that the bot's not trying to actually, it's not going to be able to vote against their interests? So, for example, one of the things you find, particularly in the media literacy education that goes on, is that the thing about trying to bring people to the middle. But one of the things about having a conversation with a bot, do you think that there's an inherent trust in the tech, that the tech isn't actually presenting itself as a threat to their worldview?
It's a very good question. So we haven't followed up this with participants. That's something we want to do, actually, give more qualitative feedback on it. There's this notion of either do technology give us more of an objective impression of things? That could be the case here, but it could also be the case that people just largely don't feel judged by interacting with what they perceive as a non-persona. Right. So a lot of these, for example, the polarization we see on political spectrums is based along party lines, right? So it's a label. And the very fact, I mean, a Democrat could argue something very sensible, even to a Republican, but the very fact that they have the Democratic label attached to them makes it impossible for the other side to kind of like accept that very argument. And so this could be something that where bots that, you know, and this bot, if you've seen it, we carefully also made sure that it's a little bird, right? So it has no gender. It's called biasy. So it's really up to the user to interpret the authority, I would say, notion of that bot. So we try to remove that as much as possible. The moment you have a person, there's always more confounding or like more signals coming from that person and your past relationship, or what do you know about that person, that might influence the way you interpret that information. And hopefully bots are a way to kind of like, step out of their context and have a context-free conversation.
Cool. Do you want to get that last question in the chat, and then
Yeah, Nerissa, do you want to say it, or should I read it?
So I think, I would go ahead and read it. Sounds like Nerissa's internet is pretty bad.
Okay, so she says, do you see the fact check tool being corrupted if you're using Wikipedia as the evidence base? Yeah, it's a very good question. We did use Wikipedia because we thought it's the closest to a crowdsourced information source that we have. And this is, I mean, especially for machine learning, you have these kind of like attacks that might happen even before you start training your models, right? By biasing certain inputs to your prediction or your modeling, you can already skew the prediction result. And yes, the same could have happened in Wikipedia. Fortunately, I wouldn't know which source to better turn to. And also, if we think about the trustworthiness of Wikipedia, it's very much up there on a bipartisan scale, I would say, as if we had collated them from different news websites, or even fact-checking. I mean, fact-checking websites itself are quite disputed by people who tend to be super conservative. So that the source selection is a super tricky question, absolutely.
Cool. Well, I really hate to cut it off, but we've gone over 1 o'clock. So thank you again, Tilman. That was fantastic. And yeah, please, if you guys have questions, feel free to email Tilman again. And thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invite and listening. And yeah, please do reach out if you see overlaps.
That was very interesting. All right.